Let me just start by saying that was a wonderful presentation by Namdi. He is actually one of my heroes. I was able to read one of his books myself, so it was such an honor to not only follow him, but be able to sit in on one of his presentations live. I just find his research so interesting and so great and so valuable for today, especially his experiences. Um, the talk that I'm going to give today is entitled Five Principles of African American Space and Aesthetics. It's really a presentation that came about by me really as a student when I was at University of Michigan for grad school. I just began to think about what truly was African American space. I knew what I was learning about in history class in terms of architectural history, and whenever we would get to kind of African American architectural history, it might be one or two projects. And I really couldn't get a feel for what the culture or aesthetic was behind the projects. I always found myself curious about it. And I also wondered, was there truly an architecture that reflected my experience in the United States as an African American? So this really comes from research and just following patterns of different projects I've seen, and an exploration basically that I'm on to really discover what African American space and aesthetics are. But I'll start by introducing myself. As Udo said, my name is Christian Coles. I am a practitioner in Atlanta, Georgia at Chasm Architecture, a minority-owned firm in the area that I'm proud to work at. And I'm also an adjunct professor at Kennesaw State University in Marietta, Georgia, where I've had the pleasure of exploring some of the topics that I'll share with you all today with some of my students there. And I just want to say it's great to be back at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, because when I was visiting different grad schools, actually, I was there taking tours, much like some of you that were students. So it's great to be back. Ultimately, I chose Michigan, but I enjoyed both schools, and it was a really tough decision. So it's really great to be back and to be giving this talk today. But I'll go ahead and get started. So the 5 projects that I currently have up on the screen are done by 5 very prominent African-American architects. The first one is the Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta, Georgia, done by one of my personal heroes, Phil Freelon, who I'll talk about a lot today and come back to. But the second one is the Detroit African-American History Museum that was done by Harold Vermeer. And then, of course, the Phillips House, which was done by John Chase. And then the Langston Terrace, which was done by Hilliard Robinson. And finally, the LAX theme building, which of course was done by Paul Williams. Make sure, there we go. So I want to start with 3 statements that really seek to sum up what the African-American experience is in the United States. They're done by 3 scholars of African-American history and sociology. And I think they all give a very unique viewpoint on what it's like to be Black in America. The first one is this idea of double consciousness, which was first kind of envisioned by W.E.B. Du Bois. And he basically describes the African-American experience in the US as one of a bipart experience, where African-Americans must act one way around their own race and another way around amongst others. So it's basically this idea that when African-Americans are around their own people, they are truly free to be themselves and act more comfortably. But when we are kind of in the gaze, so to speak, of other races or prominently white society, we must feel like we must act different, whether it be more mannerable, whether it be more cautious. Obviously, recent events in the US have started to shed light on some of these inequalities of the African-American experience and how we often have to enter public space or just streets with a little bit of concern or worry, and be very self-conscious about how we act and how we're perceived in society. Sadiya Hartman talks about this idea of performances of opposition, which have been foundational to African-American culture in the United States. And she describes it as the appropriation of space and interrupting everyday practice to shed light on aspirations, but also implicitly address a history of violence and dislocation of Black communities, and allow opportunities for reconciliation. So what Sadaya is really describing here is that African Americans are sometimes naturally pushed to the periphery of the United States society, and must then appropriate space or put themselves on the forefront to show that they are important to the United States culture, and ultimately are unwilling to be pushed to the periphery. So a lot of the actions of taking over different public spaces really puts our needs and our aspirations, as well as our struggles and challenges, to the forefront for others to see. And obviously that has been, as it been recent events, once again, something that we've seen more prevalent in society currently. And then finally, Pragmatic Industriousness was a coin coined by Booker T. Washington, who is really just trying to describe the industrious can-do attitude of Black Americans and the power of isolation from the gaze of white society to engage in a form of utopian self-sufficiency. As some of you may know, Booker T. Washington taught at Tuskegee University, and while he was there, had his home, the Oaks, designed by one of the professors that was there, Robert R. Taylor, and students not only supported to build the campus of Tuskegee University, which was a collection of African-American students, they also came together to help build Booker T. Washington's residence, where he invited in numerous dignitaries and lived basically until his death. But he speaks to the power of us separating ourselves, if not momentarily or for a period of time, from the gaze of other races or predominantly white society, to truly feel the self-sufficiency and confidence that comes from taking the time to determine what we value as a culture and represent ourselves in the works that we complete, as opposed to what others say we should do, or as opposed to the kind of societal norms. So with that, let me go on. All right, so I'm going to give today 5 working principles that I've developed. It's a working method, but it's 5 principles that begin to define what African-American space or the usage of space could be, and how our aesthetics begin to shake out. I mean, I'm going to talk about architecture as well, but I think as a designer, I think of architecture as truly a reflection of the culture and the heritage of the people groups that utilize it. And also, in terms of psychology, a reflection of how they utilize space and their perceptions of space. So what I hope to do today is kind of give a framework by which you can think about how African Americans utilize space, and also some aesthetic patterns that begin to combine us as a culture. So the first principle, and I think one of the most important ones, is that an African American aesthetic or spatial practice is not always defined by slavery. And what I'm not saying that slavery is not important or not a part of US history. I'm instead saying that African Americans possess cultural characteristics relating back to their African roots that evolve within the reality of slavery, but ultimately transcend it. And this sense of culture over time, which in some ways has been lost, has been a result of some practices of cultural erasure in the US, whether it be predominantly African-American communities being destroyed in place of maybe an interstate or a new development. And I'll discuss some instances of that. Or if it's just been forgetting over time, or those trends not being passed down or being discouraged from being passed down verbally from generation to generation. But basically what this means is that Blackness has its own unique character and does not exist as a response always to whiteness. So a good place to start in this argument is to talk about the depictions of African Americans in antebellum media. And this was before the Civil War. And I think this is very interesting because the narrative that's produced of African Americans is something that I feel like has had long-standing implications even today. And what you see here is basically the depiction of African Americans as somehow a subject of persecution in American society, someone that we should pity. Before the advent of photography, the visual representation of African Americans was primarily controlled by the American Anti-Slavery Society. So there was this bias in there about African Americans in slavery and how they have either overcome that or fought against the challenges associated with that. And they presented Black Americans as basically pitiable objects of persecution. So for instance, in the first illustration, you can see the story of a preacher, Anthony Burns. And the story is really, it talks very briefly about him actually, his evangelical work, but it focuses a lot more on his journey from slavery to where he is now and some of the challenges associated with that, as opposed to his message and kind of his personal journey outside of those things. African Americans were either presented as a community disenfranchised by white Americans or as pictures of flamboyant excess trying to imitate white society. So looking at the second and third images, you can kind of see that African Americans are almost pictured as this topic of satire or something that is more of a joke. So as African Americans begin to dress in kind of styles that were normal to the time, they were often seen or represented in this case, mostly in drawings, but represented as overly opulent or something, or as someone who was obnoxious and making fun of others, although they were just confining to the norms of the time, which was this idea of taking over public space, particularly major streets of the city, and parading down those streets in your finest attire. They were adding their own flair and spin to this, but it was often mocked as just a weak imitation of white society. Black culture at this time was often associated with delinquency. Obviously, there was a large portion of the African American population that was obviously not of means. So oftentimes they were not able to dress in concordance with the normal style at the times. And were often in some of the not nicest areas of the city. So therefore, you would have these situations where just all of Black culture as a whole would sometimes be described as delinquent or kind of something dangerous or something in the periphery. Satire and representation of African Americans fueled by white society that was fueled by a white society that was threatened by the idea of Black affluence and seeing it as a competition for resources. So a lot of times these different interpretations of Black Americans came from a biased mindset that if African Americans were to be affluent or were to achieve prevalence in the United States society, then there would be then less resources for other members of white society, particularly those who were not of means, even in white society, who saw this as a threat and saw this as just further competition to really succeed in society. So I think these depictions of African Americans in media are very interesting because I think if you were to look at this and you were to also look at maybe today's media, you might struggle to find the difference in the interpretation of African Americans. You would say that in some ways, maybe we are still presented as kind of subjects of persecution or as a disenfranchised community in terms of the news and in terms of modern day media. And also sometimes still, as we can see, associated with delinquency or delinquent acts. And then this final image here, which was a painting done by Thomas Bennix, really sets up this theme of disenfranchisement within the African American community. So what you see in this scene is that the African American community presented as basically a community that is negatively affected by the progress or the affluence of white society. So in this, you have, of course, this parade in New York down a major street. You have obviously different sleighs through the snow, different white businessmen and also white politicians of prominence. But in the kind of periphery of this image, you have obviously well-to-do well-to-do members of the African American community that are actively kind of being affected by all of the, I guess, all of the celebration and all of the commotion being caused in the street. So they're actively being affected by it and still presented as this community that is one that is constantly negatively affected by the progress of white society. So this is a map of New York, of antebellum, New York. And I bring this up because I think it's important to talk about kind of the appropriation of space at this time and the usage of space within New York. Two major areas highlighted here on the map, excuse me, let me go back, there we go. Two major areas kind of highlighted here on the map are Astor Place, which is of course north, and then Battery Park. Oftentimes in antebellum New York, the promenade between Astor Place and Battery Park was one that allowed members of society to promote their affluence, to promote their name, to showcase themselves and showcase basically their access to resources or wealth. You can see in this map that that primary promenade is actually flanked by Little Africa and 5 Points and the Negro plantations, which at this time were predominantly African American communities. So of course, naturally, this promenade began with, predominantly white members of society kind of having this stroll between Astor Place and Battery Park. But over time, it actually began to include more members of the African American communities that were joining from, of course, Little Africa to the north, and then the 5 Points Negro plantations a little bit to the south. And I bring this up because I think it brings up a very important African American notion of space. Attire and performances at this time, at least, of elegance were essential to antebellum African American notions of space, in that it overcame the public stigma of second-class citizenship when operating in areas associated with the upper class. So Broadway, of course, at this time, when promenading down, was associated with the upper class and was associated with wealth and status. So members of the African American community, upon witnessing these promenades and these strolls, began to join them because they didn't see themselves as second-class citizens or citizens that were more on the periphery or that were not valued the same as anyone else in society. They saw themselves as equal in that mindset. So they began to join these promenades, adding their own flair, adding their own attire, and adding their own looks, which I thought was very fascinating. And no, it wasn't imitating what others were doing. It was just responding to a social norm of the time and adding basically their own reflection on their culture and their aesthetic choices. So then if we fast forward to more contemporary times, I think this idea of the promenade or this idea of appropriating the space of the street is still utilized, but a little bit in different ways. So the photo series you see here is done by, I hope I pronounced his name right, Mattia Insulera. And it's called Goodbye Bed-Stuy, and it's just a series of images from around Bed-Stuy, New York. Predominantly, since Bed-Stuy was a predominantly African-American community, you see a lot of the pictures are really focused on the African-American community and how they utilize the space of Bed-Stuy. So in antebellum New York, you had this idea that you would promenade and take over the street. Obviously, at this point, cars were not of prominence, so you could actually promenade and take over the street. But as we move to contemporary times, obviously we have the focus on automobile traffic. So I would say in looking at this photo series, that idea of appropriating the space of the street has really pushed back and gone to the idea of appropriating the space in front of one's home or the front porch or the stoop, as it would be called. And still, of course, making yourself visible to the surrounding community, making yourself visible to your neighbors, having a social intermediary space before you actually reach the interior of your home, where you can welcome guests and, of course, engage in community activities. But basically, one of the most important social spaces before you enter the home proper. So, excuse me, didn't mean to press that. All right. So I find this really interesting in terms of kind of African-American society and utilizing space, because you see kind of the appropriation of the front stoop or the front porch as an important space throughout the United States, no matter what location you go to. Obviously in the South, it becomes more of the porch as opposed to the stoop. But important events were always associated with the porch. Sometimes classes were held there. Sometimes parties and events and celebrations were had there, so that, you know, neighbors could be a part of that as well and kind of join and drift in, join, and then leave the conversation very freely. Sometimes they also become areas of aesthetic representation. So some stoops or porches are decorated to really showcase the unique qualities of the individuals within. But basically this idea that the porch or the stoop is basically an aesthetic reflection on the person that's in the inside. Oftentimes, if you have a space that you are not necessarily, that you don't feel necessarily fits you or fits kind of how you seek to utilize space, you then begin to appropriate other areas to really express yourself. And I would say that the stoop or the front porch has become so important to African-American society as a way of reflecting ourselves and our unique qualities, even in the context of spaces that we may be forced to kind of manipulate to suit our purposes, or spaces that don't really suit how we want to inhabit and utilize space. So I want to summarize some major points in terms of Black culture not being defined by slavery. So one, Black culture is not defined by anti-racial responses or copying white culture. It does not exist in protest to white culture. It instead involves African Americans reflecting on their value and recognizing their status within an evolving representative democracy. In antebellum New York, this was done through promenades. In contemporary New York, this could be done through being visible on the stoop, or still in some cases appropriating the streets for different protests, or just having, you know, simple things such as block parties or things like that. So the second point is really the idea of the practice of vernacular citizenship. And this really relates very closely to the opinion I mentioned earlier of Sadiya Hartman, and this idea that African Americans really refuse to be pushed to the periphery of United States society. So I want to start by defining what vernacular citizenship truly is. It's a response to the denial of political subjectivity by those of African descent in the Americas. So basically, a response to the idea that you are not important in terms of the politics of a nation, or not important in terms of the history of a nation. It demands equal democracy, as the United States is supposed to be a nation founded on the idea of equality for all and equal democracy. But we sometimes find that it's equal for some and not equal for all. So vernacular citizenship really demands that it's equal democracy for all, not just one major community of society. It utilizes presence and action as an instrument for change. So it uses the power of gathering together as a community and putting oneself in interrupting the societal norms to shed light on challenges or social injustices that might be in place. So the power of community and the power of being there in person and the connection from human to human. It defies the power of white racial assumptions to define what is seen, what has happened, and what it means. And what this basically calls into question is that history will be and always has been a matter of who has the ability to, one, document what happened, what their opinion is of what happened, and what their unique viewpoint is on the matter. So obviously in American history, a lot of history has been more white-centric or more white-focused, just given the segment of society at the time that had the power to write and to put those ideas, to archive those ideas for others in the future. So vernacular citizenship really starts to challenge some of those assumptions. So I want to start by talking about Richmond, Virginia, which is not far from where I grew up in Hampton, Virginia. And its status. You would look at these images, and of course you see the statue of Robert E. Lee near Capitol Square. You see an aerial view of Capitol Square, and you also see kind of the entrance to the Virginia State Capitol. And you would see all these kind of inclusions on the landscape, and you might think of Richmond as a predominantly Confederate city, as it was the capital of the Confederacy, or maybe a predominantly white city in terms of the different monuments and whom it celebrates in the context. But actually, as we kind of go through and talk about Richmond, I want to make more of an argument for it as more of a Black city, in that at the time when in antebellum and for post-Civil War Richmond, a lot of times the larger percentage of the population that was actually living in Richmond was actually African American or Black, given that there were so many African Americans needed for the day-to-day services of the city. So there were more African Americans affecting the city and its environments than there were actually white Americans affecting it, which I think is fascinating. And you start to see small instances of that as we start to look at the context. But these, of course, are some images in Richmond. And this is a totally different view of Richmond that maybe you may have seen kind of more in contemporary media, as there have been protests in response to the killings of different African Americans around the United States and some of the results of that. Interestingly enough, another appropriation of space to bring ideals or challenges to the forefront. But I want to talk a little, I'll come back to this image and talk more kind of about the appropriation of space within Richmond, Virginia. But I think in order to really understand what's happening in these three photos, which of course there's the Robert E. Lee statue again, this time, of course, defaced and also projected with images of different African Americans that have recently been a victim to police violence in the United States. In this current picture, I believe it is George Floyd, but the monument was actually projected with numerous members of numerous African American victims of police violence, and also prominent civil rights leaders over time. But you can see that this is Capitol Square again, of course, covered with protesters. Yes, predominantly African American, but also of other races as well, kind of protesting the inequalities and policing practices in the United States. But this all begins really at this time period in Richmond's history, which was just after the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln visited the city after the Confederacy really retreated and abandoned the city. And I want to bring up some key points of what's happening in these different illustrations of his visit. On April 4th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln visited the city of Richmond, led by Union forces, after the Confederate Army had abruptly withdrawn the day before. He was, of course, greeted by a massive public celebration that was generated predominantly by the city's Black residents, but also there were white residents as well that were involved in the celebrations. Now, coming back to this idea of depiction of the African American community in the media, the white-dominated media kind of at the time collectively focused on the adulation of Lincoln, equating the Black participants of the day to a triumphant chorus of sorts, welcoming the president and celebrating the power of his presence. And accounts of the day really stripped Black Richmonders of their agency and saw them as unruly, mindless, out of control masses seizing control of the city public spaces. This was actually a misrepresentation of what was taking place at the time. It it wasn't so much about Lincoln and his visit, although that was the focal point that was, of course, given at the time. It was more so, if thought of in a different viewpoint, it was more so a reflection of Black residents acting deliberately and decisively to collectively express their political subjectivity and overcome placelessness. So within the Richmond context, African Americans were oftentimes placeless. They weren't allowed to go into Capitol Square or some of the major squares within Richmond that had such prominence in the urban environment. They weren't allowed to utilize certain streets or go into certain neighborhoods. So really less than the fact that Lincoln was visiting on this day, this was more so a moment of freedom to be able to promote oneself in these spaces and be visible in these spaces for the first time in what had been years before this could even happen. So this was one of the first times that Black Americans at the time, or African Americans at the time, really felt that they could make themselves known or showcased in the city. And it was misrepresented at the time by the media. Public spaces and thoroughfares were important tools for the African American community to showcase their citizenship, as they had long been subject, of course, to spatial alienation, as I stated, and not allowed in certain areas of society, beyond the areas of the city that were, quote unquote, meant to be for them. But as I stated earlier, there were more of them in the city than there were even white residents at this time. So I just find that to be kind of an interesting social situation in the city. Fast forward beyond this point to more contemporary times, a community that was began shortly after the emancipation of African Americans in the city, not so long after Lincoln came to the city himself and gave a speech concerning, it hasn't been confirmed, but most believe he gave a speech concerning African American residents being free to kind of take ownership of different spaces in the city and begin to reincorporate themselves into the urban fabric. Shortly thereafter, communities very similar to this one begin to pop up in the city. This is the neighborhood of Westwood in Richmond, and it was originally began by emancipated African Americans, and through a series of challenges, still actually stands today, and is still being still a prominent neighborhood within the city, which I find to be very interesting. Sometimes, excuse me, 1 second. Oh, there we go. Sometimes some of the challenges associated with these communities, when they're not valued kind of from their founding, is that they're oftentimes at threat within the city for different developments. Westwood, for instance, was at threat to be torn down for a public park for a local kind of more white-dominated community next to it. The community began with the communal space of the church, and later a schoolhouse and 2 stores were added to it. The city actually, as I was stating, attempted to replace the neighborhood with a public park for the white suburbs in 1942, but residents often, in a unique instances, fought back and actually combined together to fight against that practice and actually won that battle. The city also, after that fact, when there was not a public park put there, condemned the wells used by residents, who then had to utilize fire hydrants to actually have access to water. And this became a challenge and was fought against by the residents of the community until water and basic services were actually given to the community in 1947. So the community oftentimes existed and endured through no access to basic services that were available to all residents of Richmond at this time. And as I stated, the community still endures today. But you can see kind of some of the consequences and also some of the characteristics of Black developments in the city. Very focused around community and very focused around the power of togetherness. And I would say that this community would not have existed if it were not for the power of being together and working together to fight some of the challenges that were faced. And another community that I'm showcasing here, another predominantly African-American community started in Richmond shortly during this period of emancipation, was Frederick Douglass Court. It was developed actually by University Realty Company, a group of prominent African-American businessmen, envisioning a neighborhood with modern homes on spacious lots. So this was very much that Booker T. Washington idea of kind of self-sufficiency and working together as a community of African Americans to create a neighborhood that really reflects who we are and how we utilize space. It was designed by the first Black architect in Richmond, Virginia, who actually graduated from Hampton University, Charles T. Russell. Some of the unique characteristics associated with this development was that the lots included were 3 times the size of other lots in the city, allowing for larger front yards, backyards, and porches, which I actually find very interesting because having just talked about New York and the idea of the porch and the front step being important, I think it's interesting that in this case, even in the South, there was still that focus on the front yard, the porch, that social space to welcome in neighbors, visitors, things like that. And I think that really supported this idea of a tight-knit community, which was needed in this case to endure against some of the challenges that they faced. And then, of course, larger backyards, more space, then again, to, to connect with nature, but also to socialize and have different events. And then the homes were based on the design of the 4-square plan, which was pretty popular in the United States around this time. The picture I have here is a Sears and Roebuck company advertisement for the 4-square plan. So you can just see how that began to operate. And the community almost, in this case, in terms of challenges, was replaced by the Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike, which if you look at the history of American cities and their urban fabric, oftentimes prominent streets, what you might call the Black Wall Street of certain cities. Here in Atlanta, where I'm currently based, Sweet Auburn is kind of considered the apex of African-American culture at a time, and also kind of an economic hub for African-Americans at one time in the city. It was actually at one point, before it's kind of declined to where it is today, being revitalized today to be something different, but before it's declined to what it was today, it was actually cut off from the larger city of Atlanta and downtown Atlanta by, of course, the I-75, I-85 corridor, the interstate that begins to cut it off. So it's very common in different United States cities for African-American communities of prominence to be raised or taken advantage of in order to build different infrastructures for the city. And obviously, sometimes these practices are more racially biased in nature, and are practices that we still struggle against today, even though some of those same biases may not exist in urban planning, but are still things we have to respond to, because strategies and interventions included at the urban level obviously affect the city for years to come. So in Richmond's specific case, it was the Turnpike. Residents opposed it, came together as a community, ultimately fought it, and the community still stands there today as this example of African-American development and African-American accomplishment in the city. Oh, there we go. So I find this to be a powerful image. This is a artwork done by a Nigerian American artist named Kehinde Wiley. And I find it to be a very powerful image. It's entitled Rumors of War. And it really takes the idea of the Black urban youth and places him in a position of prominence akin to how you might perceive, a Confederate statue in the city of Richmond, or, statues of different American patriots. And it really is a bold representation of the use of space, movement, and self-representation critical to African-American protests. So oftentimes this work of art is put into, put kind of intentionally in different public spaces around the US. It's traveled to different areas. I actually have it pictured here in New York, in Times Square, obviously kind of very much frequented at this time, as you see by the crowd around it, but obviously very much in a position of very much appropriating that space and very much creating a kind of steering away from the norm, or kind of a questioning of history in a way, and how people are represented in history. It basically defies a white-centric expectation of who has knowledge and the courage to usher in the future. So obviously, with some of the different memorials and statues we see, these are obviously presented as very courageous figures that have had importance to history. So this places the Black urban youth who has courageously, in the case of what this monument is really encompassing, braved kind of the dangers associated with Black urban living, whether it be, increased rates of crime, police hostility, all of those numerous challenges, and places him at a position of bravery or courage. And I find this to be very interesting, and mostly interesting in its controversy. But I place this image here because this statue is actually, it's no longer in New York. It's slated to actually be moved to Richmond, Virginia, and placed next to the statue that it, in essence, mocks a little bit, which is the, I believe it's the Confederate statue of, I believe it's Stewart. It's not the Robert E. Lee one, but I believe it's Stewart. So this really encompasses this idea that the mobilization of the African-American community, which has been really so important, as you can see through the history of Richmond, but also through the history of other cities, to progress and kind of fighting challenges, often creates discomfort and challenges the status quo, societal norms, and structures of hierarchy. Yeah. So with that, I want to start, talking about some more aesthetic choices, but I think it's important to establish the foundation of these different choices by looking kind of at history and kind of Black notions of space and how we begin to inhabit space in the United States context. So these really start to follow some patterns in terms of our aesthetic choices, and in terms of when giving those opportunities to truly reflect our culture, how do we begin to do that, and what tools do we begin to use to do that? And I think this argument really relates back to a term that I hope you all attend the later speech today by Natalie, because she coined this term, and I also really love to utilize it. A lot of these aesthetic choices are really founded in Africanisms, or this idea that African Americans, though some elements of our connection to African culture and African traditions are lost, we still have these small instances, whether consciously or unconsciously, where we relate back to some of those principles or heritages or cultural linchpins. So the first kind of point is the idea of pattern or rhythm. So obviously rhythm can relate to music and dance and kind of a certain pattern of beats, but it also can relate to architecture and artwork, in that sometimes a certain rhythm of the graphic is established, or a certain kind of pattern of the ornament or a design is established. And in Africa, this has really been kind of an important tool to distinguish what the different regions, tribes, and different, of course, areas and different cultural unique facets. So this map of Africa really speaks to this idea that Africa is almost a continent of patterns. Each geographical region, or each kind of people group, begin to associate themselves with a pattern that really truly represents them and the unique qualities of themselves. And oftentimes these patterns are integral to whether it be telling certain stories or kind of reflecting on important cultural elements of wisdom and different things like that. So patterns are a visual representation of different rhythms. They typically are inspired and found in nature, which the artist overlays a rhythm on. So a lot of these patterns are often founded by items that are in nature. Obviously, nature is always surrounding us and forms an inspiration for a lot of things we do. So a lot of artists in Africa, when considering these different patterns, look to nature, at least initially, and then basically add a remix or a rhythm to it to begin to create these different patterns. Textile traditions began in Africa as a way of distinguishing tribes so they could be recognized from a distance. Textiles commonly consisted of bright colors and large shapes. And men often actually created these patterns, which I thought was very fascinating. And obviously, the patterns directly relate sometimes to clothing or different cultural artifacts, but they're oftentimes also utilized in the architecture as well. You can see here by the, I hope I pronounced this right, Ndele House. And then of course the Tibele House in Burkina Faso. And then of course the palace in Nigeria that is represented here. So I want to relate this to the idea of patterns within African-American space or within the United States. So oftentimes, the enslaved people groups of the United States from regions of West Africa and other places, kind of a result of the diaspora, often engaged in the practice of quilt making. And this really connected kind of this idea of rhythm and pattern back to some of their African roots in a way. And some of this, of course, has been lost today, kind of the characteristics of this, but they're actually still quilt makers. These are actually quilts from the Gee's Bend neighborhood, and some of the, and kind of a very old community of African Americans there, not old necessarily in terms of age, but maybe old in terms of traditions and practices and heritage, and kind of some works as they still produce quilts to this day, some of their works in traditional African American quilting traditions that were kind of inspired, of course, by African textiles. So textile tradition was carried on in the US. Remember I said in Africa it was predominantly done by men. In the US it was predominantly carried on by women because of Western patriarchy and patriarchal standards, which is kind of a manipulation kind of African American society fitting into the societal norms of the United States in terms of the gender roles associated with men and the roles associated with women. Traditional African weave was not regulated by a specific pattern. The creator of the weave was free to change and alternate the pattern as they saw fit. I like to relate this idea kind of to the idea of the Hip Hop Cipher, if you all have ever heard of that. It's kind of this idea that one person may establish a beat or a rhythm and start with some lines, and then another person is free to join in and add their own flair, add their own lines, still following the same beat. And it's really just a free and open democratic approach to making where everyone is valued in the process, every voice is valued, and every person adds a unique twist to what's going on. It was important to recreate and change old patterns, obviously, to keep the tradition alive and to pass down the practice to other members of society. Quilts were an improvisation of European American patterns with important exceptions in most cases. A break in pattern was symbolic of a rebirth of ancestral power in the creator or wearer, and was known to keep evil spirits away. So oftentimes the breaks in different patterns were put there intentionally due to cultural viewpoints at the time. Straight lines were believed to allow evil spirits to travel. So oftentimes they were discouraged in the different quilt making traditions. Obviously they utilized bright colors. There was asymmetry in the patterns. They weren't as geometrically strict or rigid. They were often weaved together utilizing different patterns and forms. And they were often included large shapes within them. And really the number of patterns in the cloth really told a story about the wearer of the cloth, because improvisation and multiple patterns really protected, one, the maker of the quilt from people copying them, but also created a strong sense of ownership of the artwork. And quilts often told stories of family heritage, lineage, and tradition. Some of them could be more pattern focused in nature, but they still ultimately told a story, because the more patterns that you were able to include in your quilt, the more you might be associated with wealth or having access to resources, because you had obviously not only access to the person and the time they had to make that quilt, but also the idea that you brought in these different fabrics to the table. And quilts are also used in the United States as important tools to send messages or map out routes for members of the Underground Railroad. So they were oftentimes storytelling pieces, oftentimes aesthetic choices to really distinguish a person, and oftentimes just reflections on the different, maybe the different items that different people worked with. For instance, quilt number 5 is made with using predominantly jeans and other patterns. So these are work clothes that were actually cut and utilized to make this quilt, telling the story of workers. So very interesting material qualities, but oftentimes always telling a story and always connecting one to the wearer or the maker of the quilt. And continuing with this idea of pattern and rhythm of space, I think it's important. It's not only an aesthetic for maybe pattern or rhythm, it can also promote a certain development style or a certain approach to adding space or developing spaces. The images that I have here are actually, in the first one, an aerial view of a collection of African compounds, a plan of those African compounds. And really what I'm showcasing here is this idea of fractal geometries that have recently been found to be inherent in these different developments. And what a fractal geometry really is a never-ending pattern that is infinitely complex and self-similar across multiple scales. What that really means is it's a repetition of one geometric form over and over again at different scales. So you can see kind of here, not only is the traditional African compound kind of based upon the circular form of, a hut or kind of a mud architecture or a mud building, but it's basically repeated in numerous ways throughout the compound. So the general shape of the compound, how the huts are arranged, or how the spaces are oriented, has that same circular shape. Within that, you have a collection of circular spaces that decrease or increase in scale to support different programs and practices. And then, of course, the innermost courtyards, or kind of the branching courtyards off those different spaces, begin to also take on that circular form. So basically, the natural repetition of a form, creating a larger development that has an ease of aggregation. And like I said, it was open to addition and aggregation. It used to adapt structures like, for instance, the shotgun house, which I'll bring up in a second. It was often, sorry, got ahead of myself there. The shotgun house, which I have a picture of here, an image of an early shotgun house, was actually started through a West African tradition, a vernacular structure there that included a front porch, and then of course, kind of the long linear spatial arrangement in the back. It carried over to the United States, of course, through enslaved people groups, and is kind of seen as kind of a reflection of African American vernacular and culture at the time. But why it's so interesting as kind of a way of arranging space is that it's so easy to add spaces, to aggregate spaces, and it's very flexible in how it can play out. You may have seen 2-story shotgun houses. You may have seen connected shotgun houses that make it kind of more of a double wide. You may have seen a very long one. So it can change and really evolve to the needs of the person on the interior, as opposed to it kind of limiting their growth. Very similar to the African compound in that way, where spaces can be added to suit the addition of family members or different things like that. And I have an image here actually of a floor plan of the National Museum of African American History, which I'll bring up a little later, but it also has this idea of fractal geometries, in that it's the repetition of the square form and kind of this idea of nested spaces of squares. And so a project that I want to bring up kind of in terms of this idea of pattern and rhythm is actually done by Jefferson Caples, or Caples Jefferson Architects PC. And it's a project that they've done for Weeksville, which was at one time a community of recently freed slaves in New York City that was lost at one time and only really had 3 buildings that were still left of the community. And when they were kind of redeveloping the city grid in this area, they came across them and began some historical research on them and fought to keep them as they realized that these were actually kind of the remains of this prominent African-American community that was once there. So really this Heritage Center seeks to celebrate that. But I think what's so rich about it is kind of the sometimes almost slight use of pattern within the project. So you have kind of these grayish slate tiles on the front of the building that really begin to represent, have their own pattern qualities, but the designers used it to really represent kind of the importance of scarring patterns. And of course, utilizing natural materials and the inherent qualities of that. But a lot of times the patterns are dependent upon kind of the dynamic natural environment around them. So in this case, you have a fence that begins to cast these organic forms or these traditional kind of metalworking forms down on the sidewalk as pedestrians inhabit it. This is just an aerial of it, so you can kind of see the existing community to the right, houses that kind of fight against the grid of the city because they were developed on a different logic. And of course, the Heritage Center surrounding kind of a central courtyard, respecting those houses, but and providing viewpoints out to them. And I think this is kind of a rich image. This is one of the walkways that kind of walk around those houses. And of course, it's glass so that you can see the original architecture of the neighborhood. But also it begins to incorporate patterns in very small ways. The etching on the glass brings patterning to the wood, and the arrangement of the framing also brings pattern to the sidewalk and the walking area. So going on to my 4th point, which is this idea of texture, symbol, and shape. And some of these points overlap a little bit because obviously things that have rhythms and patterns can also have textures and symbols, but I split them up because sometimes they're utilized differently. So kind of as it's important in kind of contemporary society, we've typically seen adinkra symbols in different ways, and they've kind of become a precedent for graphic design of different things and also other symbols that have followed them, but they obviously originated in Ghana and a kind of a product of the Ashanti people there. But symbols in various African cultures are visual representations of traditional cultural values or ideas. Historical structures built by enslaved groups at the time occasionally incorporated these cultural symbols, and I'll bring up some examples of that later, but they cast cultural truths, stories, and philosophies presented down through generations. Symbols were typically worn for special occasions by the socially elite, and they were especially utilized sometimes in terms of funerals. And the symbols were incorporated into a variety of artifacts, including the architecture. So if we kind of fast forward to enslaved groups' use of the symbol, oftentimes they were incorporated in very small ways, different structures to kind of provide a commentary or provide kind of a statement about them. So what you see here is the Cotton Exchange building in Savannah, Georgia. And one of my students, when I was teaching one of my studio courses at Kennesaw, actually pointed out that through her research that the symbols incorporated in the Cotton Exchange symbol actually match adinkra symbols, and were in this, as the structure was actually built by enslaved groups, begins to make sense. Enslaved people often brought knowledge of cultural symbols with them and incorporated them clandestinely. Wrought iron, as you can see throughout New Orleans and other places, has become kind of synonymous with the French Quarter, but was often produced by Black artisans who apprenticed under European blacksmiths. And once they learned their craft, began to utilize symbols in different ways to tell a story through their metalworking. Sometimes stories about Europeans or whoever may be living in the residence, sometimes sending messages to the general public, but always including kind of different elements of Adinkra symbols and different hidden messages amongst their work. And you can see even in carvings and intricate detailing, those symbols oftentimes show up and relay different messages. Like, for instance, some of the symbols found on the Cotton Exchange Building, for instance, represent Adinkra symbols for inequality or a social inequality, which I think is fascinating because they were providing a commentary on the inequality of society at the time. So these find their way into different works, obviously clandestinely, but share an importance in terms of storytelling and passing down knowledge through generations. And those are still used today in a variety of different ways. One group called Black Space that kind of provides a argument for the African-American aesthetic or spatial practices within architecture is this community organization called Black Space. But you can see that they've even started to use symbols to represent some of their major viewpoints and represent some of their beliefs in terms of the incorporation of African-American spaces into the United States. So symbols can still serve a certain purpose, even in contemporary society, to talk about what combines us or what brings us together as a group. And obviously certain symbols such as, the Black Power symbol, or, different murals that have been incorporated, or the Black Lives Matter, different murals that have been painted on the streets, can start to speak to the unity of African Americans as a race, but not only us as a race, the unity amongst all of those who fight for social justice and equality. So the project that I brought to kind of illustrate this point was actually done by Rodney Leon, who's done like a fascinating series of projects that really have cultural significance to them. But this is the African Burial Ground, which is kind of a monument to enslaved people groups that were once buried here in New York. And it really uses the idea of Adinkra symbols very directly, and uses them to speak to stories of the different residents that, or the different citizens that were buried here. And it also symbolically kind of represents different African ideals towards death and kind of the spirituality surrounding death. Kind of this idea of being reintroduced to nature. So you start out in this kind of low point of the memorial, looking at kind of the map of the world, thinking about the diaspora, taking in the different symbols, and then transcend this this beginning very narrow staircase, beginning narrow and uncomfortable, but getting more comfortable as you continue to go upward on the staircase, and finally ending within nature and kind of the peaceful calm associated with it, as death is kind of this return to nature and the calm within it. These are just some images kind of different points in the project, first entering the staircase and this idea of the oculus at the top, that moment of hope within this kind of struggling with the emotions of what took place, of what has taken place. And then, of course, the use of the different Adinkra symbols to tell different stories or speak to kind of the legacy of those that are located here. And then the final point I want to bring up, because I know I'm running a little short on time, is the idea of color and its importance. Obviously, color in terms of humanity as a whole is a connection with emotion or a connection with vibrance, and really connects back to nature and kind of the colors present there. But colors culturally have been utilized for different purposes and have different meanings to them. But oftentimes they add a certain life and energy that can be missed. So colors in African culture are steeped in political, societal, and cultural beliefs. Obviously, the meaning of the colors can vary from place to place, but I've done some research on it just to see what are some kind of combining qualities of kind of the interpretation of color. And I've come to these conclusions. Red is oftentimes associated with bloodshed during slavery and feelings of danger, urgency, daring, or energy. Red is a very prominent and powerful color that really has association with energy. Black is oftentimes associated with the color of our skin or mystery. Sometimes also Black can be associated with evil as well. But it has numerous meanings, of course. White is oftentimes associated with peace or purity. Gold and yellow are oftentimes associated with the sun or wealth. Blue is oftentimes associated with peace, love, and unity. Purple associated with royalty, wisdom, passion, or luxury. Green is often associated with new life, growth, freshness, or healing, and that really comes from nature, as green is one of the most prominent colors in nature. So of course, it begins to provide a focus on nature when you think of the interpretation of green. And then gray is associated with consistency, security, authority, maturity, and stability. But obviously, the colors are utilized in such a variety of aspects of African culture. You can see here in basket weaving traditions of Uganda, here in the ornament of different different cultural architecture, through the Ankara fabrics of Nigeria, and then of course through artwork as well. This is actually an artwork by let me make sure I pronounce his name correctly. Okwoji El Drag, I believe is his name. He's most times thought of as the Michelangelo of Nigeria in some cases, but you can see his artwork kind of representing this almost religious scene is so immersed with color and the emotion that color begins to create within the scene. And then of course, color carries over into the different cultural artifacts of African Americans as well. This is a mural by Cory Barksdale in Atlanta, Georgia. He's done a series of murals that kind of speak to African American culture, but obviously always utilizing bold application of color. I like to throw this one in. The image underneath that is actually an image from Beyonce's visual album that has Pharrell in it, but I like kind of the use of color in it and the use of kind of the texture and the pattern of kind of a found object within it. Then of course, through interior design, this is a apartment designed by Apartment 48, which is kind of an African American owned interior design firm in New York. And then of course, plates as well that are from a African American cultural society for at-risk youth and kind of the founder of that society. So color is still important in terms of African American culture, and is sometimes of even more importance given the loss of certain other traditions in terms of patterns and textures and things like that. So the project that kind of begins to summarize this is another one done by Phil Freelon and Perkins and Will, which is Emancipation Park in Houston, Texas. And I think it's fascinating because the park is meant to represent, obviously, the emancipation of enslaved groups in the area. And Phil Freelon really makes use of color and texture and pattern to really add a sense of energy to the site, which I think is really palpable as you walk around it. These are just some different images, kind of the front entrance, the use of kind of the oranges, the deep reds, the almost like goldish hues. And this is just like, I think is fascinating, kind of the rhythm of development within the park. So you kind of, when you look at it from an aerial view, it almost gives this interpretation as almost like a quilt or kind of stitching together fabric when you look at it. And the image underneath kind of the aerial view showcasing the Emancipation Memorial, almost to me, Phil, is almost a living symbol of sorts, in that it's something you can walk around, something you can walk through. It's not something just painted on a wall. It's symbolic of freedom and this idea of human freedom and kind of the excitement with that, even though it is an installation. I think it's almost what I like to call a lived-in symbol of sorts, where you interact with it and you almost want to replicate the action associated with it, but it still memorializes kind of that memory. And I'm going to end with this. I want to end with the National Museum of African American History and Culture, because I think it really begins to summarize the main points of the presentation. Starting out with W.E.B. Du Bois' kind of ideal of the double veil, and that kind of acting one way around one's own race, but acting another way around another race, for instance. The National Museum of African American History really kind of encompasses this in its corona exterior cladding, which really provides this idea of being seen but not seen. It's protective in that you can't be seen from the inside, but you can still see out beyond to the National Mall. And some other ideas present within it. Of course, Booker T. Washington's ideals about a separation or a momentary reprieve from white society to truly discover what's unique to us and what really defines us. And you could think of the African American History Museum in DC as more of a break from American society as a whole, to really reflect on what African-American culture and society is. And then, of course, and even in a small kind of gesture, the front porch is still present here. The idea of kind of that main entry to the space where one is visible to the public. Events can be held underneath kind of the entrance canopy as you come into the museum. People can socialize here. It's a place of just kind of informal discussion and kind of ideas towards what's being seen on the interior. So still this idea of the front porch and its importance and the appropriation of space around to discuss ideas and to bring oneself to the forefront. And of course, this idea of kind of reflection from the inside of kind of the National Mall and kind of the memorials that sit on the outside. I think this is a powerful image kind of looking towards the Washington Memorial as it almost like peeks out from the corona looking at it. And I put this image last because I think it's fascinating as an image because the National Museum of African American History is basically doing within the National Mall context what numerous African Americans have done all over the US, which is this appropriation of space to bring one's ideals to the forefront. It is appropriating the space in a large sense of the National Mall, which could be considered America's front yard or America's public space, the reflection of our ideals as the United States and American society. And really begins to interrupt that and provide something different and a different language to it. It reflects the scale of some of the surrounding buildings, but it still has a twist and does its own thing within the context, even in terms of the pedestrian promenade, which in this case is more curved as opposed to kind of this more direct linear axial progression to the Washington Monument at the end of the mall. So I think it's very interesting what it does, even as a structure within what could be symbolic of the most important public space in the United States. And I think this is truly what an African-American architecture should be, in that it should be something that speaks to our culture, our values, how we utilize space, but really provides a commentary on some of the injustices or some of the societal norms that really affect negatively different minority communities, not just African-American communities, oftentimes other communities as well. And I don't think it's a space just for African-Americans to discuss these issues or inhabit these spaces and enjoy these. I think it's for everyone, because without the discussion concerning the injustices of society and the inequalities of society, we can never really achieve in the United States a situation where we all can be joined together, recognize our differences, but join together as an American people to accomplish a common goal. And I will end there.